Welcome back to lecture number 2, American Values and Principles in the Gilded Age, 1877 to 1900. I hope that the last lecture was somewhat clear and you could hear my voice and you were able to take some good notes that we can discuss in class and use this information as we begin our study of history. So today what we're going to do is turn our attention from the principles and values that you saw in the preamble of the Constitution, the idea of the Gilded Age that we talked about in class, that everything turned to gold, streets were paved with gold, that everybody seemingly was making lots of money, and that the idea, too, of the epitome of American values, that rugged, individual, hard work, resilience, grit equals success, measured in terms of money. And again, we can look at that as sort of a myth, or is this really how our American society and our economy works? So those are some of the things that you can keep in the back of your mind as we move forward. So today we're going to move forward and turn our attention both to agriculture and to factories, and what I call this is the capitalist revolution. So, the United States had always been a market-based society with an economy of small-scale producers, small-scale farmers that manufactured goods and sold them, traded them for much of our history. And what we're going to see that takes place in the 1877 to 1900 is the appearance and growth of large-scale farms and large-scale factories that we would call sort of the corporatization of the American economy. So bigger, more moving parts, more employees, more money, more machinery that you can see there pictured on the screen. So let's take a look at first at agriculture. So the number of acres farmed from 1870 to 1900 totaled 225 million acres in the United States. Now, that may or may not mean anything to you, but if we consider that from 1607, I said 1607, to 1870, the total number of acres farmed in the United States was 189 million acres. So in the 30 years from 1870 to 1900, we see a large increase in the number of acres being farmed. So the question is, how and why did this huge expansion occur? And in large part, the United States is blessed with lots of land. The availability of land that can be farmed is and was and still is abundant in the United States. And we see here too the presence of the United States government and laws that it passed. So in 1862, during the Civil War, Congress passed something called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act, little known today maybe, actually gave settlers willing to move out to the Midwest or the West 160 acres of farmland for free. The only thing that you had to agree to do was actually farm, or what they said, improve the land. That is, farm it. The appearance of lots of settlers in the West living on lands given to them by the United States government shows us clearly that the government plays a role in our economy. We hear a lot about this today in our politics, that maybe the government shouldn't play a role in our economy, the government is too big. But I want to point out that throughout our history, the government has always played a role in our economy, and this Homestead Act is a really good example. In addition to more people, that is settlers moving out to the land, we see that rapid advances in farming technology, the use of steel, in particular steel plows, steel reapers, steel threshers, made farming far more easy to do for people. Therefore, the 160-acre plots that settlers originally farmed began to be combined into far larger plots of land, and because of the use of machinery. So you see there on the left a farmer with a horse and plow, the old-fashioned way, very slow, and then you see on the right the modern thresher machinery that is able to harvest crops rather quickly and efficiently, with fewer people too. So one of the other things we're going to see is, while a lot of settlers did go out to the lands, by 1900, we're going to see a rapid decrease in the number of people engaged in farming or agricultural activities. And the question is, so people don't farm anymore, what do they do? Well, those people would then move back into urban areas, cities, where we see the growth of large-scale industry and factories taking place. So really kind of a movement out to the west and then a movement back to sort of big cities. In 1870, in fact, to give you a statistic, 53% of American people worked in agriculture, and by 1900, the number had declined to 40%, and it would continue to decline each decade thereafter. Today, roughly 2%, that is 2% of our population is engaged in farming and agriculture, and I think you can see the connection. Technology means that fewer people can farm more acres of land, produce more crops, etc. So that's something that was going on. And again, the idea is that people left the farming communities, small towns, rural villages, to migrate back towards cities where there were greater opportunities for jobs. So let's turn our attention now to the rise of big industry. And I think that I already mentioned, but I'll mention it again, that the rise of big industry really coincides with the Civil War. And that leads to sort of another lesson in history, that wars tend to produce lasting changes in a country. Sorry, I got cut off there. So wars tend to produce lasting changes, and the Civil War is no exception. So large-scale businesses appeared as a result of the Civil War, and they continued to grow into what today we call the modern sort of corporation. So what is a corporation? Well, a corporation is a company that is given legal recognition as a person by state governments. And what this means is that companies can exist as individuals that have certain rights and certain things that they can do. So companies can enter into contracts. Companies can, or corporations can enter into contracts. Corporations can own property, in fact, do own property. They enjoy the protection of the law. And that was a big change that we see occurring after the Civil War and in this period that we call the Gilded Age. Additionally, corporations offered the capitalist class, that is, those with money to invest, a chance to invest their money in business, in the business, in exchange for a share of the profits. And the really interesting thing is the investor is only responsible for his or her share, but mostly his share of the money invested in the business, should the business lose money or go bankrupt. So the corporation really offered people protection. If I invest $10,000 in a company that makes steel plows, and the company goes bankrupt and loses all of its money, I'm only responsible for the $10,000 that I invested, not the entire amount of money that company lost. And prior to the advent of these corporations, that was in fact the case. So if you had shares or an interest in a company, you could be liable for the entire amount of money that the company lost. Now, this gets rather technical, and we don't really want to go into a lot of the legalities of businesses and corporations, but nonetheless, that was a fairly significant advance. So let's take a look then at some other numbers. The number of corporations really grew rapidly from 1870 to 1900, and they really then become the backbone of the United States economy. And the number of companies estimated to be in existence in 1870 was 140,000. And by 1900, there were some 500,000 companies, corporations in existence. So you can see that it increased fivefold in a span of 30 years. And I think that's a rather significant thing. And so what is it about big corporations? What is it that big corporations were the backbone of the U.S. economy? And why is that important to know? Well, it's important to know because as the economy goes, so a nation goes. The more businesses, the more corporations, the more opportunities, the more jobs. So the United States is then able to provide jobs and opportunities, again, for those farmers that left farming, but also then for immigrants and people coming to this country. And again, when we talk about opportunity, we need to remember the idea of the American dream that becomes rather prominent. And the idea that in the Gilded Age, hard work, success equals money, and that is gold at this point, or at least measured in gold, if we believe that. The other thing about companies is it allows a nation to become a producer of all sorts of goods for consumption at home and as we see the proliferation of goods being produced, we think about, again, technology. So we have time-saving devices and machines. Think about the advent of the light bulb and what that did to revolutionize our lives. Can you imagine having to light an oil lamp in the evening just to simply have dinner or read by or whatever? Today we flick switches and boom, presto, we have light. So the idea of making life easier, making life better, I think goes hand in hand with the growth of these corporations. We're also able then to begin to see a consumer-based society. That is, corporations make things and the people buy things. So that's really going to be, again, something that's really important in our economy. And the last thing I'll add is the United States at a certain point was able then to export a lot of what it was making. In fact, if we look at the total amount of exports measured in dollars, in 1870, it was $451 million. I like these precise figures, right? How do they figure this out? I don't know who does it, but it does exist. So from 1870, we have $451 million. By 1914, we have $2.5 billion in exports. So the United States quickly becomes a nation that makes, produces, and also exports to other areas of the world, which gives us some clout, some importance that other nations simply put. Okay, sorry, I got cut off again. My computer seems to want to go to sleep on me. I hope you don't feel the same. I'll end this lecture with one question. Why did the United States industrialize so rapidly in this time period after the Civil War? Well, a couple of reasons. One, raw materials and resources. The United States had an abundance of wood, of coal, of oil, of cotton, of copper. So along with the farming revolution, we see a revolution in mining, whether it be coal, whether it be copper, and then oil production and the extraction of oil and refining oil becomes something that's quite important. Cheap labor. The United States had a very young population. We had some 39 million people in 1870, and we had 76 million people by 1900. So the United States population in a period of 30 years almost doubles. Not quite, but almost. Young people are willing and happy to have jobs, as it is today. As college graduates, they want a job. They might be willing to work for less than, say, a person who's been out of college for 20 or 25 years. And we also had then the presence of immigrants that came into this country from Europe and from different parts of Europe. By the 1870-1900 period, we see Italians, we see Greeks, we see people from the areas in Russia all leaving their homelands because the economies in those states or the persecutions in those states were such that people chose or were forced to leave their lands and came to the United States. And at this time, there are very few, if any, restrictions on immigrants. In fact, the only restriction applied to Chinese immigrants. There was a Chinese Exclusion Act, yes, exclusion, in 1882. Otherwise, all immigrants were welcome. In fact, they came in record numbers. In fact, some 21 million immigrants came between the years 1880 and 1920. Also, we see that in America there was the ingenuity or the inventiveness of the American people, and we can measure that by the number of patents that the United States government issued. In the 1860s, there were some 64,000 patents. In the 1870s, some 125,000 patents, and by the time we get to 1900, we're talking hundreds of thousands of patents each year being issued by the government to inventors of new products and new ideas. So one example, for example, is the Singer sewing machine that revolutionized the making of clothes. We might not think of sewing machines as being all that terribly important, but when I was growing up, I remember my mother had a sewing machine and she would actually sew clothes for us and herself. Not something that typically happens today, but that was one of the early inventions. The last thing is government policy. The American government, though many thought it should be small and be out of business and just stay out of the affairs of the American people, the government did in fact get involved in the economy, and it did so to favor the growth of big businesses and corporations. And one good example of this is the tariff. Tariff is a tax that's placed, levied on imported goods. And so a tax on imported goods helps American manufacturers so they don't have to deal with competition from abroad. And this is something that the American government did, in addition to using troops and militias to deal with angry workers and strikes. So with that, I will stop for this time. We'll pick up next time. Thank you.